We often associate silent cognition with monks or mystics, but this time let's start with battlefields. History's generals have long relied on a form of quiet knowing. Military history is marked by its own forms of silent wisdom. Erwin Rommel, nicknamed as the Desert Fox, was said to sense enemy patterns before any scout reports arrived. In his African campaigns during World War II, he often moved his troops without consulting field maps. His generals would find out after the fact that his instincts had preempted enemy maneuvers. Likewise, Napoleon claimed that he could intuit the movement of troops like a living map in his head. Or take Hannibal, who crossed the Alps with elephants, a suicidal plan, according to all tactical thinking. But Hannibal wasn't thinking in the conventional sense at all. He was listening to a kind of internal topography. The Romans couldn't match it, because they were thinking too hard. They followed the roads. He followed the shape of chaos. All of them were operating with a cognitive bypass. There are moments when the mind leaps over its own fences, the fences of logic and reason, our dear Cartesian corridors with their fluorescent lighting and predictable turns. We build these structures to protect us from error, from madness and mystery. We call them critical thinking. We teach them in schools. They're useful, sure, but sometimes they are the very things we must abandon to reach the summit. Cognitive bypass is what happens when the mind skips the usual step-by-step thinking. Instead of working through a problem in a slow, logical way, it cuts straight through the mental maze, reaching a decision or insight in a flash. It's like a shortcut your brain takes, jumping over the usual reasoning to get straight to understanding. You're in the supermarket, or folding socks, or halfway through a sentence, and then, insight, a solution, a realization, a pattern, the kind you could spend weeks searching for with formal reasoning but never find. It bypasses the conscious narrative completely. Think of Archimedes in the bath. He didn't solve the principle of buoyancy with a pen and scroll. He stepped into the water, saw it rise, and something clicked. His mind, free from rules and formulas, jumped to the answer. Eureka. Take Srinivasa or Ramanujan, perhaps the most mythologized case of silent mathematical knowing. Raised in colonial India with no formal education in advanced mathematics, Ramanujan claimed his theorems were revealed to him by the Hindu goddess Namagiri in dreams. When British mathematician G.H. Hardy received Ramanujan's letters in 1913, pages of bizarre, unprovable formulas with no explanations, he was prepared to dismiss them as madness. But they turned out to contain mathematical truths that would take decades to verify. Hardy said Ramanujan's work was like a finished puzzle, with no sign of the pieces or how they fit together, only the final image. Next we have Mozart, who famously said he could hear a full composition before writing a single note. All the notes are already there. I just write them down, he claimed. I honestly think these stories are mind-blowing, so let's not stop here. In the realm of science, Dmitri Mendeleev, the father of the periodic table, saw the complete structure of the elements in a dream. He had been obsessively working on how to organize chemical elements by weight and property, and after a night of restless sleep, he woke with the arrangement complete in his mind. The insights was so solid that the periodic table remains one of the most enduring frameworks in all of science. In philosophy, silent cognition takes on more abstract but no less vivid forms. Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century rationalist who shaped modern ethics and metaphysics, described the highest form of knowledge as intuitive science, a direct perception of the essence of things. It was not deductive, not based on empirical data. It was a mode of understanding he likened to seeing the divine geometry of the universe all at once. In Spinoza's framework, this wasn't fantasy. It was the culmination of cognition, a non-linear insight that arose only when the mind was sufficiently quiet. Even the hardened empiricist David Hume stumbled on this. He admitted that much of what we call knowledge, particularly our belief in causality, The sense that one event follows another by necessity is not actually provable through reason. We feel it to be true. Our minds are structured to expect patterns. That structuring is itself a kind of silent cognition, a substrate of expectation that doesn't emerge through proof but precede it. Just a few years ago, the psychologist Gary Klein has studied how firefighters and emergency responders make life and death decisions with almost no time to think. His research into what he calls recognition prime decision making shows that these experts often rely not on conscious analysis, but on patterns they've internalized so deeply, they no longer need to be processed consciously. They don't deliberate, they know. And this knowing is frighteningly effective. And yes, madness lurks here too. Schizophrenics often describe sudden downloads of meaning, intense symbolic clarity without any narrative coherence. Carl Jung's Red Book is a map of this terrain. Encounters with archetypes, dream visits from Philemon, insights too dense for his waking mind. He didn't follow reason. He followed vision. The bypass can be divine or derailing. Yet we also see it in the everyday sorcery of artists. Bob Dylan, when asked how he wrote like a Rolling Stone, said, "It wrote itself. I just wrote it down." Bowie said similar. So did David Lynch. "I don't understand it. I just catch the ideas as they pass by." None of them outlined first. They accessed some other channel, a nonlinear, nonverbal intelligence with its own grammar, its own logic, dream logic, wound logic, myth logic. In his book, David Lynch beautifully describes his creative process of going beyond thoughts. According to Lynch, the mind is like a body of water, and transcendental meditation, TM, allows you to dive beneath the surface level of noisy thoughts and reach the big fish of inspiration and insight. You guys can listen to the whole audiobook for free. I have linked the sign-up link in the description. The thing is, in meditation and in deep states of stillness, when internal dialogue finally pauses, cognition still occurs. You may even perceive things more clearly when not narrating. The insight arises not from thinking about awareness, but from being inside it. The cognitive bypass is the monk's prize and the scientist's nightmare. A truth that skips the system entirely. Time is the great illusion we live by. But if time doesn't exist, what are we left with? A timeless mind. The concept of now becomes suddenly alien when you attempt to remove the measurement of it. It's not that time's gone, it's that it's no longer the ruler of reality. The self you identify with, it's all structured in time. You wake up, you go to sleep, you mark your befores and afters. But the actual mind, the mind that observes, doesn't live in time. It lives in a constant state of awareness. The true nowness of your experience doesn't need a moment to be pinned to. You're not just a series of thoughts racing forward in a timeline, heading somewhere towards something. Think of the mind as an infinite landscape, but with no horizon. When you stop seeing time as a ticking clock that constrains your thoughts, you realize that everything you remember is nothing but an abstraction, an image, a projection, like snapshots of moments trapped in a gallery that doesn't exist in real space. Without time, how do you measure anything? When you can't use time to distinguish the past from the present, there's only the present as the past. Every thought, memory, or future plan becomes simultaneously existing. That feeling of going back in time to a memory, that's not time traveling. That's just you experiencing all of time, past, present, and future, as if it were happening at once, like watching a movie where the timeline is not linear but is woven together in a non-sequential dream. We are born into a calendar, not a world. The first breath we take is time-stamped, recorded, and archived, as if existence begins only when it is measurable. We are not taught to perceive, we are taught to sequence. Time is fed to us like a language we never chose to learn. Sunday, youth, appointment, career, gray hair, end. From the beginning, we are not asked what we are, but when. Childhood is defined by what it leads to, adulthood by what it produces, age by what it runs out of. Time presents itself as the neutral backdrop to life, but this is part of the spell. Time is not neutral. It bends the mind inward, folds the self into a thin line, and demands movement along it. It builds identity out of chronology. Your name becomes braided with memory and prediction, until your sense of self is a flickering thread stretching between what you remember and what you fear. A person becomes a narrative, but the narrative is a trick. The one who sees, the one behind the eyes, has no clock. To most, the spell is seamless. It is invisible. Time becomes air, unquestioned, constant, ambient. But some, by accident, by trauma, by holy design, slip through. Some stare into fire long enough that it begins to stare back. Some sit in stillness for days, chasing breath until breath vanishes and only the chase remains. Some drink from the leaves and roots that open the seams of perception. They enter sideways. To these few, time begins to tremble. It becomes a shimmering wall, no longer solid, no longer absolute. They may hear its collapse before they see it. A sound, like wind passing through something that isn't quite there. They feel a fracture. The moment no longer sits within a sequence. The spell stutters. In Zen, this is called direct transmission outside the scriptures. The sixth patriarch, Winning, illiterate, heard a single phrase from the Diamond Sutra, "Let your mind function without dwelling anywhere." And his mind exploded open. Not with thoughts, with clarity. A recognition that was too fast, too intimate, too real to be reduced to language. In Western philosophy, you find echoes in Husserl's phenomenology, the pre-reflective experience of being, a knowing that has not yet been packaged into concepts. Heidegger went further. Being reveals itself, but not to thinking. The most thought-provoking thing in our thought-provoking time is that we are still not thinking. What did he mean? That true insight happens in the silent gaps, between thoughts. Not the knowing that sits in the halls of academia, sharpening its teeth on logic. Not the clinical knowing of cognition, sectioned neatly into frontal lobes and neurotransmitters. This is something else, something older than words, something that stares out from the black eyes of Paleolithic shamans daubed in ochre beneath caves of antlered gods. This is the knowing before the garden, before the apple, before Eve unwrapped the syllables of awareness and named the serpent. This is prelapsarian cognition. It knows, but not in the language of thought. It knows like roots know where the water is. The Upanishads called it pratyabhijna, recognition without deliberation. The mind does not arrive at truth. It simply uncovers what was always present. In Taoist terms, it is wu-wei, action without action, knowledge without effort. You do not calculate the Tao. You fall into it like a stone through still water. The ripples are not conclusions, they are confirmations. This is silent cognition, not passive absence of thought, but the burning away of thought like fog under a white sun. It is the cognition of the mystic in the 13th hour of the fast, of the child before self-awareness blooms, of the Sufi whirling until identity disintegrates, and what remains is not self, not idea, but immediacy. It is what Rimbaud touched when he declared, "Je est un autre," I is another. Because the I that knows this way is not the daily I. It is the ghost behind the ghost. Thought is a machine. It takes raw experience and processes it, translates it into categories. But silent cognition is when the machine breaks, and instead of panic, there is wonder. Instead of interpretation, there is a direct communion with the thing itself. Not the flower as flower, not the sky as sky, but the pulsing, unspeakable suchness behind it. What Zen calls tathata, the thisness of being. In the writings of Simone Weil, she speaks of grace as something that enters like a beam, unbidden, wordless, There are truths that can only be received, she writes, through an absence of thought. This mode of cognition is not exclusively spiritual. In the modern psychological lexicon, we might call it intuitive knowing, though that term is too soft and too vague to capture its intensity. It's been studied in cognitive science as insight problem solving, where a person arrives at a solution, not by working through logical steps, but through a sudden restructuring of their internal representation of a problem. This is the so-called aha moment, often preceded by silence, disorientation, or even frustration. Studies using MRI imaging show that these moments are preceded by a burst of activity in the brain's right anterior temporal lobe, a region associated with the integration of loosely connected information. But even science, with all its instruments, cannot explain why the insight arrives when it does. The best it can do is measure the moment after it happens, never the thing itself. The great artists and poets have lived in this space. They describe their most profound moments of creation, not as the product of effort, but as something that passed through them. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote that the poems came to him in silence, without his choosing, as if dictated by an invisible intelligence. Virginia Woolf described the moment of vision as something that lets in heaven, a kind of holy intrusion that could not be summoned at will. This kind of knowledge is not controlled. It is not generated. It is received. It defies the standard subject-object relationship that characterizes most forms of thinking. You are not analyzing something from the outside. You are inside it, or it is inside you. What makes silent cognition so powerful and so strange is its disobedience to linearity. It is non-temporal. It does not respect the chain of cause and effect that governs conscious thought. You do not build toward it, you fall into it. And when it comes, there is often an eerie sense of inevitability. The knowledge feels not just correct, but somehow ancient, as if you are remembering something rather than discovering it. Silent cognition resists ownership. It doesn't feel like you figured something out. It feels like the knowledge arrived through you, as if you were simply a conduit. And perhaps that is the point. Silent cognition is the mind's way of stepping aside to let something larger, deeper, more integrated speak. It is not thoughtless. It is beyond thought. It is what remains when the machinery of thinking is no longer needed. A knowledge without words. Truth without map. Marcel Proust said, "In the absence of thought, the soul can finally breathe." So, let your soul breathe.